The following video features what some may find to be inappropriate language, including the use of a racial slur. All of this language occurs in the game footage being discussed, and in the game itself is placed in very specific contexts. Welcome to History Respawned. My name is John Harney. Today we're discussing Wolfenstein II, the New Colossus, Machinegames' follow-up to the 2014 game Wolfenstein New Order. Like that previous game, the New Colossus is set in a 1960s world under the heel of a victorious Nazi party. But whereas the previous game was set in Europe and exposed the player to a realisation of Speer's vision in post-1945 Nazi Berlin and concentration camps fueling an ongoing Holocaust, Machinegames brings us back to the United States for the sequel. We learn more about protagonist B.J. Blazkowicz, and the game directly engages with some very interesting questions about this fictional post-war defeated United States. How would the Nazis rule and how would Americans react? How does collaboration with a white supremacist hierarchy reinforce existing issues in American politics and culture in the 20th century? Here to talk us through some of the questions is a repeat offender. Robert Greene II of the University of South Carolina has graciously agreed to join us once again. Robert previously guested on our episode discussing BioShock. Robert, welcome.
Thanks for having me back. I'm certainly grateful to be back on once again.
Yeah, it's great to have you back. It really is. It's really a thrill. And it's also a thrill. I'm also very happy to say we are joined today by History Respawned creator Bob Whittaker. Bob, welcome to you.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me on.
The game has specific representations of alternatives to what might be considered or has traditionally been presented as, norms in American politics. So we have Grace, who's a character who's heavily shaped by a kind of a popular memory or a popular vision of Black Power, and Horton Boone, who, I suppose for lack of a better word, is kind of a Cajun communist, I guess, is kind of his representation of the game. Robert, how do you think that meshes with the historical reality of Black Power in American discourse? And I ask that because I myself kind of had this initial reaction that, well, if the United States is under Nazi power since 1945, I don't know that the same historical conditions are in place that create the same kind of, visual language or political language of Black Power. But then maybe, am I perhaps guilty of ignoring the deeper roots of American Black Power? Like, what did you think of those representations in the game?
I first watched footage from the game, in particular the cutscenes involving Grace and her very look and image in the game. I initially had the same reaction you did, which is it's really difficult to conceptualize of a Black Power movement as we know it existing in this world. With that said, though, it is worth noting that within the realm of what's called Black Power studies, the historical underpinnings of Black Power have been understood to be a longer trend of Black nationalism. So, for example, historians like Pennell Joseph, Ashley Farmer, among others, they've done a great job in the last 10 to 15 years of showing how Black Power doesn't just arise in the mid-1960s, but in fact, a lot of it owes a great deal of its history and lineage to earlier Black nationalist movements. To give you a quick example of this, in our timeline in 1961, Harold Cruz, the African-American writer and polemicist who's best known for the book Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, in 1961, he wrote a couple of essays about this idea of revolutionary nationalism among African Americans. And in those essays, what he basically argues is that Black nationalism was making a comeback. And this was in 1961. He and others are saying that in places like New York City, Chicago, Detroit, on the West Coast as well, you have a Black nationalism that's informed by people like Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam, informed by a wide range of other sources like the lineage of Marcus Garvey in the 1920s, for instance. You have all these different intellectual currents creating the conditions for a new Black nationalism. And in the early 60s, folks in places like New York were already beginning to take note of this and contrasted with what you saw in the South with the Civil Rights Movement. And so to answer your question, there were already conditions in the U.S. before 1966-67, when we traditionally date the start of Black Power, to indicate the rise of the return of a Black nationalism. And throughout African-American history, there's always been a strain of some sort of Black nationalism. It's just taken different forms and had different goals and objectives. obviously, if Nazi Germany conquered the United States, you'd have a black nationalism that was still even far more different from what we're used to.
Sophia, he in there? No. Sophia, out of my way!
He does not deserve this. You know he does not.
Don't bullshit me. I saw him with her.
He's young. He likes her. He does not know better.
He knows goddamn well not to spend time with some dirty little nigger girl.
What do you think of this notion of kind of a pre-civil rights, a pre-1964 American intellectual landscape? I mean, how fertile is it for this kind of like this father character, like the guy who would greet such an otherwise horrifying reality of like Nazi overlordship as almost a godsend, because it allows him, because it raises up his race? I mean, how can we square the circle a little bit as historians to try and contextualize that idea?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think there are two ways to think about this. First, we should remember that before the United States entered World War II, you did have thousands of Americans who were self-described Nazis in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But you also have this larger undercurrent of American society that, again, has elements of anti-Semitism and racism and xenophobia and sexism to it that's much closer to the mainstream. I mean, I think one of the intriguing things about the Nazis conquering America scenario is that if the Nazis were to actually do that, and we take Wolfenstein's storyline seriously, one of the first things they're going to have to do is to essentially destroy the American Academy. Because if you think about the period from roughly the 1930s through the 1960s in our timeline, the real world, so to speak, you had an evolution on thinking about race in the academy that was taking place. It was sparked by anthropologists, it was sparked by historians, it was sparked by a wide range of social scientists, most notably with books like Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma. You have these people who are really beginning to rethink race and take it from African Americans are subservient and are lesser than white Americans because of biological reasons, to saying, well, actually, no, there's no biological basis for racism. This is a socially constructed idea that starts in the academy and really spreads out into society. And again, World War II itself plays a big role in this. Again, the United States defeating Nazi Germany in 1945 and the horrors of the Holocaust being shown to the world around that same time, it forced a lot of people to rethink ideas about racism that they had as Americans. Again, to your points about the civil rights movement owing a lot to Pan-Africanism and decolonization, another big thing the civil rights movement owed to was memory of World War II. And the idea of defeating an enemy like Nazi Germany that was based on racism. During the war itself, even though at home in the United States there are many Americans who did not want to think of the war as a war to destroy racism, again, you had thousands of Southern whites who were saying, we're actually fighting this war to preserve states' rights, for example. You had other people, African Americans most notably, and liberal white Americans saying, this is our chance to finally become a truly anti-racist country. You've got propaganda films like Frank Capra's Negro at War, where they're showing African Americans in a positive light, fighting and dying for the United States. So if the Nazis are going to conquer the U.S. in the Wolfenstein series and install their own order, they will find allies on the ground who disagree with all of this, who are not fans of the Popular Front or liberalism or New Deal, who want to take things to what they thought they used to be like. And so I think Blazkowicz's father, and that whole story, I think, is really intriguing because it's foreshadowing the kind of collaboration you see later on in the game.
I love strawberry milkshake. It's perhaps my favorite American thing. So simple. Just milk and ice cream. The rest of the menu, however, I think you will need to address. I think it needs to be more German. Yes.
Yeah, I'd love to swing back around to Horton Boone if we might. I really think this is a fascinating game stylistically. And there's this, the scene in the game where an increasingly drunken B.J. Blazkowicz is arguing, screaming, yelling really, as they debate kind of, the good guys went over to fight in Germany and the commies stayed at home. There's this whole kind of, this is kind of the row. But, but Horton exists, and not just him, but the people around him as well. Basically, all the New Orleans characters exist as this kind of almost like socialist alternative, rejected alternative. But Robert, you're certainly the expert here in terms of, American intellectual debate and discussion. What do you think of what the game is doing here with kind of this concept of American socialism? And yet again, as historians, what do we know about American socialism? What kind of connections are interesting to us here?
I have to be honest here. As a Southerner and as a historian, Horton Boone's my favorite character in the entire game. Because I don't know if the game producers read a lot of civil rights history or not. But Horton Boone actually, in some ways, that whole sequence where he's debating with Blazkowicz about fighting Nazi Germany, as I watched that, I thought to myself, if I wanted to actually teach what's called the long civil rights movement, I would actually use that argument. Because there are historians for the last 15 years. So back up for a second. Jacqueline Dowd Hall wrote an essay around 2005 talking about what's referred to as the long civil rights movement. And it's this argument, this thesis among American historians that the civil rights movement does not begin with the Montgomery bus boycott. It doesn't begin with the Brown v. Board decision. It actually begins in the 1930s with things like the creation of the New Deal, the rise of the Popular Front organizations involving communists, socialists, liberals, and other racial progressives, so on and so forth. And so Horton Boone, while he's a caricature, there were people actually like him in the South. There weren't many. I want to stress it. There weren't that many. But there were people in the South a few who were leftists, who were dedicated to pushing what he refers to as a civil rights movement. And the timeline that he actually describes is also pretty funny because, again, the Second World War is a watershed for civil rights activism. You start having early versions of people sitting on buses and refusing to get up because of their race. You have that happening during World War II. You have protests against racism during the war. And so Boone's actually right that there was an attempt at a civil rights movement even in the 1930s and 40s in the South. It wasn't as large or as successful as the one in the 50s or 60s, but you did have communists in the South who were doing that kind of thing. I think of books like Robin Kelly's Hammer and Hoe, which is about the Communist Party in Alabama during the Great Depression. And for those of you listening, that you heard right, there was a communist movement in Alabama, a very small one, but it was there in the 1930s. So in a sense, the game, and this might blow people's minds, when it's talking about civil rights, it's actually reflecting the more recent historiography among American historians of saying the civil rights movement as we think of it now doesn't begin with Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks. It actually begins about a generation before that. And those folks at the beginning included socialists and communists. This fact that the left in America saw civil rights as not only the right thing to do, but also as a way to get African Americans on board with a larger leftist project.
And I'll be damned if I'm gonna raise them in a world run by these Nazi assholes. So what's it gonna be? You hillbilly, degenerate moonshiner, Bolshevik cowards, goddamn traitors.
Bob, obviously you and I work on this quite a bit. So what do you think of how New Colossus is kind of engaging with, and I don't say this in a derogatory way, but kind of like a popular or almost like surface level conception or representation of that word Nazi, of this idea of what that's supposed to stand for?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think this game improves on that idea, that theme, even upon the first Wolfenstein. I think whenever you're doing a piece of Nazi exploitation, there's always the danger of disassociating those kind of Nazi images, those propaganda elements, from their original intent and from their original moral implications. And this is a problem now with neo-Nazi movements, with right-wing movements in the States in particular, where it seems like these images are transgressive, so it makes them cool, right? And you kind of forget how these images, what they originally meant, what they were originally used for. But I think this game, despite being a piece of Nazi exploitation, which kind of almost eroticizes power and submission, it does do a good job of giving those propaganda elements, giving that symbology, but then also making it a text for humor and ridicule, right? Also using it as a way to attack these ideas, right? To making these Nazis look as though they are worthy targets, right? These are people you don't want to associate with. This is these images, this Fuhrer cult that is promoted in the game. These are things that are evil and should be destroyed. So I think it is always risky to try anything related to the Nazis, any kind of Nazi exploitation. But I think this game, it hits the right chord, and I think it does it even better than the New Order, than their original their original attempt.
Helene, kommen Sie. Haben Sie das gesehen? Fremde in meinem Büro. Würden Sie mir bitte verraten, wer in Gottes Namen das ist?
Ja, es sind Schauspieler, mein Führer.
Schauspieler?
Ja. Diese Männer wollen für die Rolle von William Joseph Blaskowitz vorsprechen.
When I was actually watching gameplay footage and watching especially the cutscenes, what really struck me was some of the quieter moments, like when Blaskowitz is a kid and he's interacting with a black girl. I thought that was actually some of the best parts of the game in terms of storytelling, because the game developers were saying, in a way that I think even a lot of historians kind of miss, is that racism on the ground in the 20th century in the United States is not just a question of segregation or what bathrooms you can use or what restaurants you can use, that kind of thing. There's still interaction between blacks and whites on the ground, and the tragedy of that all, as you see in the game, is that it's so fraught with danger and peril because of the society they live in. And yet, at the same time, Blaskowitz has this girl as a friend of his because they have mutual interests and just get along. So I think you're right. Like the video games as a storytelling medium are becoming more and more sophisticated. I think it's because, again, we have a generation of game developers who grew up playing video games, and they probably all ask the same questions we did, which is, how can we make these games better, and how can we allow them to tell better, richer stories?
Engine Scout, red or yellow? Yellow. I hate the red ones. The red ones taste like puke. Yeah.
I think that's a pretty good place to leave it. Robert, thanks again for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, we hope to have you maybe back another time. Bob, it's great to it's always fun to talk to you about video games. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, John.
And thank you for watching. We always appreciate the help. Please come back to our channel. Subscribe if you're not already a friend of ours. Do give us a thumbs up below. These things make a big difference. There will be a podcast version of this episode available online at SoundCloud. And if you want to support us on this project, please consider visiting patreon.com/historyrespawned, where you can make a contribution which will continue to make this work possible. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.